Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our Outliers video series here. I am your host, John Raab, joined by my wonderful host, DP Lyle. Doug, how you doing?
Just fine. How you doing, John?
Good, man. We got a fantastic show for you today. As you can see, we got none other than international best-selling author John Connolly with us from Ireland. John, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I'm trying to look shady and slightly moody, but I think it's
You're
just
doing a fantastic job. We wonder if
thank
Charlie.
you.
We're
It's
wondering
Thank you
if
wonderful.
very much. Thank you.
that
That
skull
check is
behind
in
you
the
has
post.
anything
That
to
check
do-
is in the post, I guarantee it.
We're wondering if that skull behind you has anything to do with Charlie Parker or something, but we'll just leave that to
The last reviewer who annoyed me.
the
That was
last review.
about 10 years ago. And then I thought maybe I shouldn't read reviews anymore. And I've kept to that vow, but
I thought
there's
it was
the
from
guy.
Hamlet.
There's the yeah. Because that's what I do. I like to entertain the children of an evening with excerpts from John's experts from Shakespeare. Long winter evenings in our house just fly by. Fly by.
Yes, exactly.
So we're very excited to talk to you about your latest book called Night and Day. It's a short story anthology that you put together. So can you kind of talk a little about the stories and why you decided to kind of do a short story anthology?
I don't do short story anthologies very often. I think this is the third one in 25 years. I don't write very many short stories. I find I have to set aside time to rework the machinery, I think. So it can be quite there can be quite long periods without them. But I had done two things. I had written and researched a book called Shadow Voices, which was a history of it was an attempt to reframe the discussion of Irish literature in particular, but literature around genre fiction, and to look at the reasons why people were dismissive of genre, and why, when I began writing and publishing at the end of the 1990s, I had so few models for what I wanted to do in Ireland. I couldn't understand where detective fiction in particular had gone in Ireland during the 20th century. And so I spent a lot of lockdown working on this history, and it introduced me to a kind of, as I said, shadow voices, a kind of underlying thread in Irish writing which didn't get referenced very often. All of these extraordinary writers of science fiction and horror and fantasy and detective fiction, a lot of whom had simply been forgotten or who had been written out of the history. And I think that started off two things. It started off, I ended up doing my doctorate because I decided that having done that much research, I should continue on. So I finished my PhD this year with a specialization in Gothic literature and detective fiction and the links between them. But I think encountering all of these writers, it started that engine of short story writing. And I think short stories for writers, writers will always have more ideas than they ever have time to put into print. And short stories, I think, as Stephen King once said, they're a good outlet for those ideas. Not all of them are going to be crime stories. Not all of them are suited to the long form. And I think, though, the combination of those things of doing the PhD and reading an awful lot of short fiction for Shadow Voices kind of put me down that path again. So I think I wrote 6 stories in about 2 or 3 years, which was a lot for me. And then I realized that I kind of had a collection again, and it was quite nice to put them into print. So it's more varied, I think, than the Nocturnes collections, which is why it's not Nocturnes 3. There are fantasy stories in it. There is a science fiction story in it. There are areas that I haven't explored before.
Nice. Well, the one thing that I love is, like you just talked about, the different kinds of genres that you write in. Charlie Parker has that supernatural kind of feel. Your Samuel Johnson trilogy that you did for YA has, a little bit different kind of suspense horror thing in there for children. And, when I was reading and I just kind of got the book and I just jumped in and I read The Flaw first. I like short stories because I always kind of jumped in the name, and I kind of ran in and kind of read The Flaw, and I was like, oh yeah, this is quintessential John Connolly when you start reading these kinds of stories and doing it. So when you were kind of putting the collection together, are some of these, basis of, hey, they're not really long enough to be books, but like you said, just ideas to kind of put down? Or do you see any of these maybe expanding further with a new character and a new kind of longer story?
No, I don't. I don't see them as expanding. I think I have quite a set rigid thing where I like long form detective fiction and I like short form in fantasy and horror. I
Ah,
think horror and supernatural stories are ideally suited to the short form. The difficulty with a novel is that you have to give people a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean, if you're a postmodernist, they don't have to be in that order, but you do. People do expect some kind of conclusion to them. The Irish writer William Trevor once described short fiction as the art of the glimpse. And I think it's a
Yeah,
lovely phrase to use, that what you really often get is a moment or an
right.
instance, and it leaves hooks trailing in the reader's imagination.
Yes.
And that's ideally suited to supernatural fiction, because the problem with a long form supernatural story, and you know, there's a reason why, if you look at a list of the 100 greatest horror books, for example, or supernatural books, a lot of them are either novellas or short story collections. You know, because once you begin explaining the monster, you're doomed. And the explanation is never going to be quite as interesting as that moment, that glimpse of the unknown. And so with short fiction, you don't have to do that. Short fiction doesn't require any explanation. I work in the shadow of M.R. James, who was really the quintessential English supernatural writer of the 20th century, an incredibly dull man, by all accounts. A colleague of mine is writing his biography, and kind of realized that really, once James stopped writing short fiction, when he'd written them quite when he was reasonably younger, he really does nothing interesting for the rest of his life, which is a challenge for a biographer, you know, especially if you're doing something quite long. But James was the you know, his stories are often about academics, or they're usually men who have these assumptions about the world, and these assumptions are then overturned by one moment, by, as Trevor would have, a glimpse of something. And it's like the curtain is pulled across and then it drops again, but their lives are never the same. And so I think that affects how I approach short fiction. I tend to prefer writing um, short supernatural and fantasy fiction. Although for a long time, I'd had an idea in my head about two guys who were asked to kill their friend and then
Mm.
find that he keeps coming back. And they, you know, it begins to drive a wedge between their relationship, because, you know, this is obviously an awkward thing. And that became the final story, which is our friend Carlton, or our friend Carlton, which I quite like. And there was a reason why that was put at the end. And then half the book is essentially, or about a third of the book, is a very much extended and adapted version of a short piece I wrote for a short book I wrote for a publisher in England, which never went as an ebook. It was only just a limited edition,
hmm,
which was about nostalgia.
yeah.
I wanted to write about nostalgia and how books and film and music affect us, and why even what might be regarded as poor art or poor creative artifacts can become very important to us. And so it fitted in there, because the film I'd chosen was a film called Horror Express with
Yeah.
Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, which is not a bad film, but it's not necessarily the kind of film that people tend to devote 40 or 50,000 words to, you know. But I kind of was interested in why that film mattered to me, and how these artifacts, which can sometimes be dismissed by people who are unfamiliar with them, can be extraordinarily important in our lives. You know, because they're often to do with the circumstances in which we watch them, or the people we associate with them. And so that film became an opportunity to discuss those things, and seemed to fit with the tone of Night and Day.
Well, from a writer's perspective, I thought it was quite interesting what you said about the short form, because most people think that if you're writing sci-fi, fantasy, you're doing a lot of world building, you're doing a lot of rule setting, and that takes a lot of words.
Yeah.
And yet you're saying you kind of skirt by all of that and let the story.
Oh, I think you can do it in a
Yeah.
paragraph. You know, I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
they're
Okay.
two very different forms of writing. Yeah, you know,
Right.
if you're writing these science fiction sagas or fantasy sagas, yes,
Yes.
that word world building comes along. But actually, it's a different discipline, I suppose. And
Right.
that's a word we don't. It is a craft. It is a discipline. When I don't teach creative writing, and but occasionally I get wangled into talking to younger people about it. And I do try to use that word craft and discipline. But one of the things I get really annoyed about is that short stories are sometimes treated like training wheels on bicycles.
Mhm.
You know, that you write your short story and then you move on to the novel. That somehow this is the apprenticeship for the novel. And actually, short stories are completely different beasts.
Yes.
And so they have their own sets of rules. And so, as you quite rightly pointed out, there isn't the space to do world building. There isn't the space. Everything has to be done. You can't waste any time with a short story. You can't waste words with a short story. It's a bit like poetry. Everything has to count because there's nowhere to hide. And so it forces you to think about it. Well, can I do something? Can I do something in one paragraph that would take 10 chapters in a novel? Can I do something that communicates all the necessary information? And it forces you to think, what is necessary? How much of this is actually required for the story? And so yeah, it's a different form of writing. It's probably why I don't do very much of it, because it does require you to rework the machinery a little bit.
Yeah.
I struggle to write short stories and novels alongside each other because they are so different.
I agree 100%. I think like you, I came to short stories late in the game. You know, I'd published like 20 books before I tackled short stories. What I found is that they're a single issue around a single character, and it's almost like a sequence of scenes within a novel. If you look at it that way, there's a larger story, but you're telling a little component of it. And I find it very, very educational as far as writing your whole novel now, because you do learn to focus on this event. Well, that event just may be one event in a series of events in a novel. And I really enjoy writing short stories, but they're not easy, as you said.
No, and I think they tend. I found that they tended towards first person narration.
Yes.
And I think there's something very primal and atavistic about that, because back in whenever we always like to tell the big people in caves or whatever that might be, but a lot of it is somebody telling you. When we think of a story, we think of being told a story. We think of a voice telling us a story, and I think especially for horror and supernatural fiction, there's a kind of pact with the reader that we're going to suspend disbelief. And so it's somebody telling you, this is what happened to me, or this is what happened to somebody I met. And so a lot of the stories in Night and Day use that form for that reason. It's a very old way of telling a story, but it works, and it works in particular for those genres. It's harder to do with a mystery where, the great example of the mystery novel where there's that twist is obviously the murder of Roger Ackroyd, Christie's murder of Roger Ackroyd. That idea of the unreliable narrator.
Right.
You can get away a little bit with that in the novel. In the short story, you could maybe get away with it once. So what we're doing is we're kind of trusting the person telling us the story.
Right.
And it's that sense of a now James doesn't do that very often, which is odd, but he does. There is a sense of somebody who's collected these stories. What you get with James is the idea that somebody has curated these tales, and that while they didn't necessarily happen to him, this is a record that he has of these people who drifted through his life. And that's the suspension of disbelief in that case. But for a lot of Night and Day, I tended to go towards first person narration because I thought that suited what I wanted to do. That idea of pulling the reader into a story that's being told to them, and that's possibly being told to somebody.
And we've been telling stories for millennia around the campfire.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's
really
what you're talking about. That's the beauty of those short fiction. I really like that. Yeah.
But
what brought you to writing in the first place? How did you end up, putting pen to paper and doing all that? I think were you always going to do that, or did
oh, no, I think I was, and not in any. I don't want to sound like one of those awful children who comes out of the womb ballet dancing. That would be just awful. That you want to hit them on the head with a hammer. No,
come on, ballet dance for us.
I guarantee you would never sleep again. It would haunt your dreams forever. I think there are people who, when they're presented with music, are fascinated with the idea of trying to reproduce that, to play music. And there are people who look at pictures, and my children are much more, my sons are much more inclined to the visual arts. They saw pictures and they looked at the world and they wanted to reproduce it on a canvas or on a piece of paper. And from the moment I learned to read, I wanted to write things down. It became my reaction to reading, I think. And I get really annoyed. I was reading a piece in The Observer, a newspaper here on this side of the world yesterday, and it was a guy who just published his first novel, autobiographical novel. And I'd been asked what fiction he read, and he said, "Oh, I left fiction behind a long time ago. I don't read that anymore." And it was that idea that, immediately I thought, well, I'm never going to read you a novel, because you clearly have missed the point of this thing entirely. Because for most of us, we become writers because we were readers first.
Yeah.
And it is the introduction, being introduced to a book or a writer that fires something off in your imagination. For me, it was probably Enid Blyton, who I don't think was very big in the United States, but over here was, every child read Enid Blyton at some point. And she wrote across genres, like a lot of writers of her generation. But I realized the first novel I ever read unassisted was an Enid Blyton book. She wrote about these kids who had a group of crime solvers in a shed called the Secret Seven. They weren't very interesting as mystery novels, but it never struck me that they were mystery novels until somebody raised it at an event I was at. A child asked me what the first book I'd read was, and I said it was an Enid Blyton Secret Seven novel. And so he said, "Oh, so the first novel you read was a mystery novel." Now, I've just thought of them as children's novels, but they were actually mystery novels, and I suspect that was the seed that was sown for me. Even though I hadn't quite realized, because we don't think of in terms of genre when we're younger. That's not how we look at things. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing Shadow Voices was that this desire of bookstores and publishers, and maybe readers to a degree, to categorize novelists, to say, well, you're either a mystery novelist, or you're a horror novelist, or you're a science fiction novelist. That's quite a recent thing. A lot of these writers that I looked at, a lot of the Irish writers who were writing for periodicals at the end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, they wrote science fiction, and they wrote romance, and they wrote crime novels, and they wrote horror. They were writing everything. They were voracious. All of these things were tools to be used, and they looked at some stories. Well, actually, that idea doesn't suit a crime novel. That's a science fiction story. But no one said to them, you're a crime novelist. We don't publish those things. That you're stay in your lane. And so again, Night and Day is almost a throwback to a different way of writing, when actually writers were more promiscuous in terms of how they wrote. And even that idea that the idea that somehow a piece of fiction is inferior, one piece of fiction is inferior because it has a ghost in it, or it has a crime in it, or it has a vampire in it, again, would have struck readers of the late 19th century into the 20th century as just ridiculous. Like dismissing Hamlet and Macbeth as second division Shakespeare because they had ghosts in them. All of that mattered. As Duke Ellington said, that he used to say, and the other kind. There's only two types of writing. There's good writing and the other kind. And it doesn't matter whether you're writing detective stories or ghost stories or horror stories. All that matters is that you're writing the best of those that you can possibly do. And so I have no time for snobbery. But I think, like I said, that a lot of that is a product of Shadow Voices, of thinking about where do these things come from, and how recent that kind of snobbery is, and how recent that desire to pigeonhole writers is. It wasn't unusual for most of the history of the writing of fiction. That's not the way we thought about it. You wrote what you wanted to write, and as long as you could sell it, or somebody wanted to read it, you were doing the right thing. So I get kind of frustrated now. I remember interviewing Stephen King many years ago, and King saying that he didn't really think about genre anymore. And at the time, I thought I wasn't sure how to take that, because I suppose I had always thought of King as a supernatural writer of supernatural fiction. Now that I'm older, I kind of see his point. You want to follow the idea, and so I'm a writer, for better or worse. And
the rest of it, I think, is more marketing than anything else.
Yeah, I'm just
they
arranging
need to know
bookstores.
Where to put it in the bookstore. They need to know how to market
exactly it. Or the poor
but
sales
the story's
manager,
the story.
The sales manager in your publisher has to sit down in front of the people in Barnes and Noble or BAM and explain to them what the book is, and so you have to put a name on it. I remember Daunt's bookstore in London, that used to be organized alphabetically. So he wasn't, and now obviously he's the man who was in charge of it is now obviously in charge of Barnes and Noble in the United States. I don't think Barnes and Noble have quite embraced that yet,
No,
King behind kitchen design. But it would be an interesting way to do a bookstore. I remember there was one in New England that organized itself according to publisher.
Oh.
So, and it was really odd, because you'd have all the Simon & Schuster books in one area and all the Penguins in another, regardless of genre. So you kind of had to know to a degree, or somebody in the store had to know who the publisher was. And they've been doing this for a very, very long time. But it's funny, it caused you to rethink how you negotiate a bookstore.
Right.
And what I love, I think it's lovely that bookstores have information desks. in a way, part of me thinks it would be nice to get rid of them and force people to go exploring the bookstore rather than coming in with your piece of paper and going, this is the only thing that I'm looking for. Because one of the great joys of physical bookstores is that, you know, you go in and you, not that you find the book that you wanted, well, you found the book you didn't know you wanted.
Right.
The book that you probably didn't even know existed. That's why I'm very fond of bookstores that do those lovely little shout outs from the bookseller. You know, it takes the trouble to scribble a note. If somebody has taken the trouble to write a note about a book, I'm going to read the note at the very least. You know, and I may even pick up the book at that stage. And I found so many books that way. I love bookseller recommendations. So we've got off the beaten track a little bit, but it's
no, that's fascinating.
But I want to, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up, of course, you know, Charlie Parker book 21 that came out this year in May, you know, that you had out. And, you know, fans, you know, loving Charlie Parker. So can you just give a little bit about the Instruments of Darkness, which came out again in May, 21st Charlie Parker book?
Yeah, it came out, so we had been involved. What I hadn't realized was how much my personal life leaches into the books that I write. We had been involved through someone in our family. It was a very difficult court case, criminal case, in which the person was a victim, not the perpetrator, thank God. And so we were tied up in the mechanics of the legal system. Yeah. And we all have blind spots. One of my blind spots is legal thrillers. I'm not a big fan of the legal thriller. I just tend to take the view if it's legal, can't possibly be thrilling. And there are people who are kind of changing my mind gradually, but we all have those little blind spots. I suppose I don't like court case things that end up in a courtroom. I'm not that interested in. But I became very interested in the mechanics of the process by which we get to the courtroom, because that was what we were dealing with. And so it fed into a book in which a young woman may have been involved in the abduction and possible death of her child, and is drawn into this machine it's a machine for law, not justice. You know, it's a machine that's designed to crunch out a verdict, and justice is a secondary product of that. And so that was it became this book about I suppose victimhood, about how we respond to trauma, and who believes us if we say we didn't do something, and the legal system has evidence to the contrary, yet we're committed to that testimony. Who is going to believe us? So it became that became a means of exploring something we were going through at the time, I think, with those little supernatural elements that the Parker novels have. And so, and I've just the copy edited manuscript for the book that will come out next year, which is a very different Parker book, which is a very lean, much more supernaturally inclined Parker book than that book. Because I think I think as you know, both of you, as writers, we tend to react to the book we're writing tends to be a reaction to the one that went before it. At least if we have any sense. You know, you're very anxious not to replicate the thing that you've done before. And so it tends to be a response to it. So something that was very personal and quite, you know, engaging on a quite difficult level is being followed by something that is much more of a pulpy novel. I mean, it's shorter. It has a very lean narrative to it. It moves at a very particular pace, and you know that's very much a reaction to the book that went before. And then the book after that is not a Parker novel and not a supernatural novel. It's set in the 70s with the Watergate hearings happening in the background. And that's the book I'm trying to write at the moment.
Well, my wife would have been very happy if you would have said Samuel Johnson, because she saw the cover of this book and she almost flipped out going, "Is that Samuel Johnson?" And I go,
Is he back? Yeah, I loved writing those books, and I'd love to go back to them again. It's possible there's a film, although these things, you know, most of them never happen, but there are some kind of very interesting people involved in trying to bring those to, I think, to either the big or the small screen. And that might be an opportunity to return to it. Sometimes you need a little bit of help from outside.
Well, my daughter used The Gates as her senior thesis in her literary class to write a report on for that book. So she loves Samuel Johnson too.
God, I'm deeply flattered. That's boosted my intellectual credentials. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just dove into it and loved it. So
that's lovely to hear.
we're kind of near the end, but johnconnellybooks.com is the place for everyone to kind of find out everything about what you got going on. It's a great website, very informative. What social media do you kind of use the most for people to be able to interact with you and maybe get a signed copy of Night and Day?
Well, we do. I do.
For people
I
in the
still
state.
call it Twitter. I refuse to call it X. You know, in your face, Elon Musk. I quite like Twitter because it's quite short and sweet, and so there are links in the site. And Claire, who looks after that stuff for me, is very helpful on Facebook with people. So they tend to be the primary ones we use. There's also a contact John on the website, but we try to answer as many questions as possible on the website before you get to that point. You know. But it's nice that, you know, that process of interaction is actually it's often quite lovely. You know, that ability we have now to interact with readers. That really, and that, you know, in the past, you know, you would have sent a letter to the publisher would have sent it to the writer or the writer's agent, and maybe a year later, you know, you might have got a response on a piece of paper, you know, which is lovely as well. But now I think people expect something a little bit faster, perhaps.
So if you're in the States, we got to get over to what, Harrogate and Crime Fest to kind of see you at any conferences? Because
No, I'm doing a very brief. Yeah, I don't do conferences as much anymore. I felt that after about 20 years, I had probably answered every question that you could ask on a panel about noir, and I didn't have the energy to do it anymore. No, so I tend to do a couple of events each year in the US. So I'm doing a little East Coast tour for Night and Day in Maine and New York and Newburyport, just those little stores. Yeah, so you know, mostly I want to write now. I think there are, you know, as you go on, there are so many of these events you can go to and so many conferences, and I just found they were consuming an awful lot of time. And I would really, being perfectly honest, I like being home. My two dogs are sleeping beside me here in the office. I quite like my wife. You know, I have two nice sons. I'm never going to think that I should have spent less time with them. And I think as you get into your 50s, I'm in my late 50s now, you think actually staying at home is more important to me right now, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, well, John, we want to thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us again over in Ireland.
Well, they were lovely questions, gentlemen. You're good value, you two. I'll give you that.
Thank you. So the book, Doug, if you want to put it up again, the book is Night and Day. It's out October 22nd. So when you hear this interview, you'll be able to buy it again, a short story collection from the mind of John Connolly. And if you read John, you know that mind is what you want to read. And if you haven't read it, you got to read it.
You avoided the word twisted there nicely. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Yes.
But he did think it.
He did it. We could all hear it. We all heard it.
Exactly. It's that ghost in the background. Yeah.
Thank you again so much, man. We want to appreciate the time.
My pleasure, James. Continued success to you both. You're both gentlemen.
Yeah, you too.
And we'll talk soon, man. Have a good one.
I hope so. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.